Okay, Sandra Stotsky will be next, and she is the University of Arkansas professor emerita, Department of Education Reform. She is credited with developing one of the country's strongest sets of academic standards for K through 12 students, while serving as Senior Associate Commissioner in the Massachusetts Department of Education from 1999 to 2003. She served on the Common Core Validation Committee, and she refused to sign off on the validation standards, to validate the standards, due to their inaccuracies.
I can close. I'm closing down this, okay? This is yours. Make sure. Okay. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to all of you. Let me just, I think this is about where it should be. Right here. Okay. You can hear me. And I'll stand up, all 5 foot of me. So let me explain briefly the overall frame for what I'm going to be saying. I'm going to discuss first the quality of Common Core standards, the issues relating to the quality. Okay, that's better. The issue of validity, which was also addressed by Professor Milgram, and then some of the difficulties and what we can do about trying to get out of Common Core, which is proving to be a huge monumental task that may take a lot longer than any of us suspected. Unfortunately, it was slipped in as a set of stealth standards, as we know, through our boards of education for the most part. Let me talk briefly about the 4 excluded groups, and then I'll pick up and refer back to them so that you can get to understand that this was all designed and planned. Otherwise, these groups would not have been excluded. First group were parents, parents like you, parents like many across this country who are totally baffled, if not angry, about what they see happening in their children's classrooms at all levels from K to 12. They were never a response group in any formal sense, and the only relationship we know of was the fact that the National PTA was given some money by the Gates Foundation to promote Common Core's standards. And they were doing so before they were written. You have to keep that in mind. Many groups were. Second group excluded primarily from any role of influence in the development of these standards were teachers themselves, especially high school English and math teachers. This is what caught my attention at first because of what I had done and had experienced in the Massachusetts Department of Education 10 years earlier when we were developing first-class standards in all major subjects. High school teachers were always included, if not overrepresented, because they always knew more about the subject from K to 12 than teachers at lower grades. But there were no high school math teachers on any of the groups. One of the major groups you would have expected to be involved in the development of college-ready standards in mathematics. There were also no high school English teachers involved in any of the major groups, even on the validation committee, until I complained loudly enough and finally one was produced and added to the validation committee. It ended up with about 29 people, but we started out without any high school English teacher. We had no college professors of literature, literary scholars of any kind. Obviously, their input into high school or secondary English literature curriculum was unwanted. They may have been on review groups. Actually, I know of only one, Mark Bauerlein at Emory University, who was on the vast review group of people, but in general, they were absent from the scene. Third group, basically absent from the development of these standards, were state legislators, which is why I have been going around testifying for the past 2 to 3 years to 25 to 30 different state legislatures and the committees or hearings that they're holding to find out more about what are these standards, how did they happen, and what can we do about them, because they were starting to hear and are now hearing furiously and often from constituents, mainly parents, about the problems with these standards, and they want to know what it is they can do. They're writing bills, so I am advising on the writing of bills, and particularly on what kinds of committees should be set up if they want to get first-class academic standards. So those state legislators were kept in the dark. They were, as we now know, deliberately bypassed because no public discussion was basically wanted. The fourth group that was excluded are local school board officials, or school committee as we call them in New England. You would have found not one of those particularly interested people in K-12 on any of the committees. And by the committees, I mean the standards development work groups in '09, which were to develop the college readiness standards. They were composed mainly of people associated with the testing industry, something never remarked upon by our media. They have been badly trained in their own schools of journalism, I've concluded. That's a charitable way of putting it. Second largest group that would be considered a group would be the standards writers themselves. Professor Milgram has talked about the three lead writers in mathematics. I was aware and knew one and came to know the second of the three lead writers in English language arts. Their names have become very well known, if not household terms, particularly the name of David Coleman, who is now president of the College Board at a salary of $750,000 a year. He is part of a group of people that he set up as a business venture 10 years or so ago called Student Assessment Partners, and they go around to school systems around the country. He and his partner, Jason Zimba, and Susan Pimentel, who is another lead writer, thank you, helping them to implement, understand, and implement the standards they wrote. You may wonder about professional conflict of interest there. No conflict whatsoever. They're just doing this regularly with, in addition to the jobs that they have already. Third group was the validation committee, a group of less than 30 people. And we were to serve from the end of the summer of 2009 to the end of May, beginning of June 2010. Not very long, but enough to be able to see draft after draft of the grade level standards that were begun in the fall of 2009. As we now understand it in retrospect, when we can see deadlines that are available to look at, they intended to be finished by December or January of 2010. So they weren't planning a very long time to get these standards written. Contrast that with the usual 2-year period that most states have taken in developing standards. Their whole vision of what standards were clearly not the vision or based on the experience that anyone had, because these standards writers in English, as in math for the most part, had no experience writing K-12 standards. In English, they had never taught K-12, had never taught beyond K-12. They had had no majors in English. They had never written in English journals or in any education journals, any kind of serious articles on education. They were unknown to the entire field of reading, English, composition, rhetoric, anything, linguistics, anything you can name that's related to the teaching of reading in English. They were unknown. Why they were chosen, we don't know. Who chose them, we don't know. What their charge was, we don't know. How much they got paid, we don't know. The whole operation was a shady operation, but we can't get the details because there was no transparency in the operations of these committees. And as I know I have told many other groups before, and as you may probably know, we had to sign confidentiality agreements in order to be on the validation committee at the very first meeting, meaning that we could never tell anyone about anything that happened in the committee for the rest of our lives. This was the nature of the process for developing standards. Now, why this outraged me was because of my own active background in a New England town meeting form of government. Open town meeting, representative town meeting, I was on a library board, knew all about sunshine laws, and none of that applied. No transparency whatsoever, and to this day, we cannot get any information that would help us to understand the origins of these very poor standards or anything related to the personnel that were selected to be on these committees. So far as we know, the Gates Foundation and Achieve chose the writers, two private groups of the four that were involved in the development of these standards. What are the flaws, basically, in the Common Core English Language Arts standards? I would like you to just have in front of you that one page that I've prepared. It's a very short page that you can give to the chair of an English department or your local school board officials or anyone else who can read. It's very short, won't take them much time. They don't like to read much, but I purposely boiled it all down to one page. You have a two-pager from our two people who speak on standards in mathematics. I got all of this on one page. I could have said more, but if you want people to read something and understand the problems, you try to boil it down as much as you can. We have missing standards. You can see what they are. And what do I mean by a standard? This gets to the heart of the major problem that I saw from the very, very beginning with Common Core's statements. They were skills, not standards. I got a hold of your grades 11 and 12 standards from your old document that I had been a consultant to. They were, as you've heard, among the best in the country. Here is a real standard in English language arts, grades 11 and 12, and it is under a section titled Literary Response and Analysis. 3.7, analyze recognized works of world literature from a variety of authors. First sub-objective, contrast the major literary forms, techniques, and characteristics of the major literary periods, such as Homeric Greece, medieval, romantic, neoclassic, and modern times. Why is that a real standard? Because it narrows what you want students to learn in order to acquire some literary historical understanding of major works that informed the development of the English language. Remember, this is about English and the English language. So you don't have any specification of any particular titles or works, because that would be the teacher's job. That this kind of a standard respects the autonomy of the English teacher, who then chooses which work from Homeric Greece, such as the Iliad, the Odyssey, or even expanded beyond that to the Aeneid. We had something similar in Massachusetts. But that is the nature of a standard. It is there to narrow what teachers choose so that students become informed in English language arts by either the literary tradition, movement, or period, and develop some understanding of the evolution of the English language. As you may or may not know, the two major influences on the English language we speak and write today were two major literary works, as well as serving other purposes, the works of Shakespeare and the King James Version of the Bible. Those are the two most quoted works up through World War II, when there had been some empirical research on where quotations or allusions, metaphors, imagery came from. Now let me just mention the other one of the other sub-objectives for that broader standard. Students are to relate literary works and authors to the major themes and issues of their eras. That brings in the historical context for a literary work. So what you have is a true standard asking students, expecting them to become familiar with major works in the English-speaking literary repertoire, to understand their literary history and literary context, as well as the historical context surrounding these works. Contrast this, and now you go back to the first page that I asked you to look at, Section 3. Here you have, and I've tipped you, murky, badly written standards, not fewer, clearer, deeper. Here's an example of a literature standard for grade 9-10 from Common Core that asks students to determine a theme or central idea of a text, analyze in detail its development over the course of the text, including how it emerges and is shaped and refined by specific details, semicolon, provide an objective summary of the text. It is a jumble of a sentence. And as I have said before, my own high school English teacher would have been horrified by such a sentence. The people who wrote this document could not write good English, which is one of the basic requirements for someone who writes standards in the English language arts, so far as I'm concerned. I then asked over a group of 24 English literary scholars at a very small conference in Bloomington, Indiana last year, if they would give me some feedback on the quality of these standards, whatever they wanted to say. And they were the ones who immediately said, not only was it poorly constructed, it's self-contradictory. Because on the one hand, you're asking for an objective summary of a text. You don't usually do that to a literary work, by the way. Synopsis is not something that we need to have students develop skills in writing at certainly K-12 level. But all the other stuff is interpretive. It's what you would have students do to determine a theme, analyze, and explain what you see developing over the course of the text. Yes, students have to provide evidence for what is happening over the text, but that was also in your older standards as well. This was not a new idea. I tried to point out to someone that it was not at all new to ask students to find evidence from the text. And I went and I pointed out, she's now in charge of your education committee in your assembly. And I said, if you look at 3.2 in your old standards, it said, analyze the way in which the theme or meaning of a selection represents a view or comment on life, using textual evidence to support the claim. It's well known that this is what needed to be done. It wasn't just discovered by Common Core. It was there in those standards that your Board of Ed junked. And you have to keep remembering that they were the ones that decided to opt for Common Core. Why such flaws? I would suggest one major reason we can see is the whole range of lack of qualifications by the standards writers themselves. Obviously, expertise in writing standards was not desired, or we wouldn't have had such badly written standards. Where are we today? I'm going to move a little faster because I want to cover a few other topics. We now have a set of poorly written English language arts standards from K to 12 that you may or may not be adopting in your own school system. There is still local control, but I don't know how much restraint your own superintendents are exercising or how much defiance your own local school boards are willing to show. But unfortunately, in most of the country, we have these standards being implemented, and we are told that the problems that are arising in your children's classroom are because we don't spend enough money on teacher training, or we have terrible problems with the technology infrastructure that needs to be put into place, but it's definitely not the standards. So you have to be able to listen and read between the lines of all the talking points that are now being offered to explain why parents are upset and are resisting. We are stuck with a set of poorly written standards. Number one, that cannot be changed because they were copyrighted by private organizations. They were adopted verbatim, and it's clear that those standards cannot be changed. Another 15% could be added, or something could be done to even those that were there if you took off material for examples that were in parentheses. There has been, and this is number 2, where are we today? There's been no response to the parents. I was just earlier today at part of a little protest outside a building in San Diego where 15 or so parents were parading up and down with posters about Common Core. Secretary of Education Arne Duncan was inside talking at a policy advisory forum for CCSSO, which is one of the 2 groups that developed Common Core standards. He must have known parents were out there, but he did not invite them to come in, nor has he in any way for the past 5 years made any response to all the complaints that have come through, bubbled up from the grassroots activities of parents. Nor has he made any response, nor have departments of education, superintendents or commissioners of education, state boards of education. I've been waiting for one of them to acknowledge that there are some people who are very upset legitimately about these standards, or at least maybe there's something we need to look at. But there's been no response from state boards of ed to teachers themselves, who are for the most part afraid to speak up individually. As one union representative told me near Peoria a few weeks ago in Illinois, they don't want to have the word insubordination put on their personnel folder. He said at a very open public meeting, and we have it on tape, that teachers will not come to meetings at which they can be identified typically. This is now in Illinois. Maybe there are teachers here who don't mind being identified if people do know who they are. So we've had no response to the parents, no response to the teachers, aside from something that came out again this week talking about how we need to redistribute effective teachers once we have the results from the tests that are going to come. What this means, we don't know. No one really talks about what you do to redistribute a teacher. We have no response to the legislatures or the local school boards, who do have the authority still to eliminate Common Core. Nobody is even talking about the major source of the problem, which Professor Milgram was alluding to at the very end, and that is the source of bad ideas and bad strategies, which comes from our schools of education, and this has been going on for over 50 years, because I would not call all the problems we have that we see today Common Core based. They have existed for a long time. We've had a declining academic curriculum for maybe over 50 years in this country, mainly because of the kinds of strategies and attitudes that schools of education have been teaching administrators as well as teachers, and one of which you're now hearing a lot about, and that is group learning. I am appalled at the amount of cooperative group learning, project-based education that is now taking place. Almost no content knowledge is being developed by these groups of kids in clumps of 4, with the great possibility that only one child will do all the work and the others will share the same grade, but there is no research base for their effectiveness. And yet you hear about group learning being mandated all grades. So what should be something that you try to do in California at the local level? Your school boards can ask for a return to your old standards. You had among the best in all 4 subjects: science and math, ELA, history and social science. You have a state board of ed that not only has gotten rid of English and math, but is now in the process of getting rid of your superb first-class science standards. Remember, you had a committee headed by Chancellor Glenn Seaborg, who helped to develop your science standards, and the new science standards that they want California to adopt have basically eliminated high school chemistry, which I find ironic, since Professor Seaborg, who was then chancellor at Berkeley, was a Nobel Prize winner in chemistry. So this gives you some idea of the problems you are facing, and you'd have to think why. I now am done, and I'm going to be able to answer any questions you have. State legislators need to hear from you. I do not know that you will have much success writing to your state board or your commissioner, but certainly your legislators need to hear from you because they are constitutionally superior to your local school boards, who also need to hear from you. Together, local boards, or state legislatures can make changes, and in the next few years, you're going to be seeing quite a few, I think, in the rest of the country. Maybe not as fast in California as should be the case, but that it will be happening here too. Thank you. I'll be happy to answer questions later. Okay.